New Year's Eve of 2024 was supposed to be a celebration of fresh starts and resolutions, but for me, it became a night I'll never forget, and not in a good way. My best friend, Jason, had rented a remote cabin in the mountains of Colorado for a group getaway, but due to last-minute cancellations, it ended up being just the two of us. I debated skipping the trip altogether, but Jason insisted it would still be fun. The cabin was a cozy but secluded structure, perched on the edge of a frozen lake and surrounded by dense, snow-laden trees. We arrived late in the afternoon, and as soon as we stepped inside, I noticed something odd. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, like walking into a room after a heated argument. I chalked it up to my nerves about being so isolated. Jason, ever the optimist, was thrilled about the rustic charm of the cabin. It had a stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and a collection of old photographs hanging on the walls. The pictures were mostly of families, their faces frozen in time, but one image stood out, a black and white portrait of a man standing alone in front of the cabin. His expression was grim, and his eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. "That's creepy," I remarked, pointing to the photo. Jason laughed. "It's just old. Adds character." We spent the next few hours unpacking, preparing food, and joking about how we'd be the only two people ringing in the new year in such an isolated spot. By 8 p.m., snow had started falling heavily, and the wind howled against the windows. We settled in the living room with a bottle of whiskey, playing cards and swapping stories. The earlier unease began to fade. Around 10 p.m., I stepped outside to get firewood. The cold was biting, and the snow was coming down hard, making visibility difficult. As I bent down to grab a log, I noticed footprints in the snow. Large, booted prints leading from the edge of the forest to the side of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. Jason and I hadn't gone near the woods, and these prints weren't ours. I called out to Jason, and he joined me outside. Together, we followed the tracks, which stopped abruptly near one of the cabin's windows. Jason tried to reassure me, saying it was probably an animal or a hiker passing through, but his voice lacked conviction. We returned inside, locking all the doors and windows. Jason turned up the music, trying to lighten the mood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Milo, Jason's golden retriever, usually a ball of energy, had retreated to a corner, his ears flat and tail tucked. At midnight, we raised our glasses to toast the new year. Jason clinked his glass against mine and said, "Here's to making it through this snowstorm alive." We both laughed, though it felt forced. Just as we took our first sips, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Jason grabbed a flashlight while I fumbled for my phone. The signal was gone, leaving us completely cut off. We lit a few candles and huddled near the fireplace, trying to laugh off the situation. That's when we heard it, a faint tapping at the window. Jason froze. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat dry. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, Jason aimed the flashlight at the window. The beam illuminated the same man from the photograph, standing outside, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and his breath fogged the window in uneven bursts. Jason dropped the flashlight in shock, and the beam rolled across the floor, casting erratic shadows. By the time I looked back at the window, the man was gone. Panic set in as we realized we weren't alone. We barricaded the door with furniture and armed ourselves with whatever we could find. Kitchen knives and the poker from the fireplace. The tapping returned, this time from the back door. Then the windows. It was as if the man was circling the cabin, testing for weak points. The hours dragged on. Jason kept a firm grip on the poker, while I stayed near the fireplace, trying to keep Milo calm. At one point, the tapping stopped altogether, replaced by an eerie silence. We thought, or perhaps hoped, that he had given up and left. As dawn broke, the first rays of light revealed something chilling. The snow outside the cabin was undisturbed, no footprints leading away from the house. The only tracks visible were the ones leading from the woods to the window. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We packed our things in record time and left the cabin, abandoning our deposit and leaving the place as it was. Jason drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following us. Months later, Jason and I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a prank or a hallucination brought on by isolation. But deep down, we both knew the truth. Whoever, or whatever, that man was, he wasn't of this world. We've never returned to that cabin, and every New Year's Eve since, I found myself glancing out the window, dreading the sight of that familiar, unblinking face. New Year's Eve, 2024, was supposed to be quiet for me. My girlfriend, Amelia, had gone to visit her family upstate, and I had the house to myself for the weekend. Our house, a modest bungalow in a rural part of Vermont, was surrounded by dense woods. While it was serene, it could get eerily quiet at night. I wasn't much for parties or big celebrations, so I planned to spend the evening curled up with a book and a warm fire. Around 7 p.m., as the winter sky darkened, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat near the large living room window. The snow had started falling again, blanketing the ground in white, and everything outside seemed calm. That is, until I noticed something odd, a faint light flickering in the woods. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it might be a reflection or perhaps a passing car, though we lived far from the main road. By 8 p.m., the flickering light appeared closer, almost like a lantern swaying in the trees. I felt uneasy but told myself it was probably someone hiking or a neighbor passing through the woods. Still, the sight of a lone light moving deeper into the forest piqued my curiosity. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and slipped on my coat and boots. As I approached the edge of the woods, the light seemed to vanish, swallowed by the darkness. I stood there for a moment, scanning the treeline. The snow muffled all sound, and the air was deathly still. Just as I turned to head back inside, I heard a crunch behind me, a deliberate footstep. My heart leapt, and I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I waited, but the only sound was my breathing. Shaking off the feeling of being watched, I hurried back to the house and locked the door behind me. Milo, our cat, was sitting by the window, his ears perked and tail twitching. He was staring into the darkness, fixated on something I couldn't see. At 9:30 p.m., the light reappeared, this time much closer to the house. It swayed back and forth, as if someone were deliberately trying to get my attention. I grabbed my phone to call Amelia, but the call went straight to voicemail. The unsettling thought that someone might be out there, in the freezing cold, sent chills down my spine. I decided to call the police. The dispatcher sounded calm and reassured me they'd send someone to check the area. While waiting, I kept the lights off and peeked through the curtains. The light was gone again, but fresh footprints in the snow were visible leading from the woods toward the house. A knock at the door startled me. I jumped back, my pulse racing. It wasn't the police. That was too fast. I hesitated, clutching the phone in one hand and a fireplace poker in the other. Another knock came, louder this time. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. My hands trembled as I backed away, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Then, a third knock came, this time from the back door. I froze. There was no way someone could have moved that quickly from the front to the back without leaving footprints in the deep snow. My phone vibrated in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. It was the police, letting me know an officer was on their way and would arrive shortly. I thanked them and hung up, but before I could move, I heard it. The distinct sound of breathing, heavy and deliberate, coming from outside the living room window. Slowly, I turned toward the window. There, staring in, was a face. A pale, ghostly face with wide, unblinking eyes. My flashlight illuminated their features for a split second before they vanished into the night. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but their presence was undeniably malevolent. The police arrived minutes later, their lights flashing as they pulled into the driveway. I ran outside, nearly slipping on the icy steps, and explained what had happened. The officers searched the woods but found no one, though they did discover the footprints leading to the house. Strangely, the tracks ended abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. The officers stayed for a while to ensure I felt safe before leaving. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, every creak of the house sending my nerves into overdrive. The next morning, I found something chilling. A lantern sitting on the edge of the woods, its glass cracked and its metal frame rusted as if it had been there for years. Inside was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Happy New Year." I don't know who or what visited me that night, but I haven't spent New Year's Eve alone since. The memory of that pale face and the ominous message has stayed with me, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. On New Year's Eve, 2024, my friend Ethan asked me to house sit while he went to celebrate in the city. Ethan, 28, is the outgoing type, while I, at 34, prefer quieter evenings. His instructions were simple: feed his cat Milo, ensure the doors were locked, and enjoy his home theater setup if I wanted. It was a win-win, as I didn't have big plans and appreciated the extra cash. Ethan's house was a cozy, two-story home tucked in a suburban neighborhood in Denver, Colorado. I arrived early in the afternoon, got the keys from him, and settled in. His house had a warm, rustic vibe with lots of family pictures and a few quirky antiques. Milo, a chubby tabby cat, greeted me with a mix of indifference and curiosity. As the evening fell, I got comfortable in the living room, watching a movie with Milo sprawled out on the carpet. Around 9 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. Expecting no one, I checked the peephole cautiously. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing a puffy red coat and holding a small purse, stood on the porch. She introduced herself as Ethan's coworker, Sarah, and claimed she left her gloves inside during a recent visit. I hesitated but eventually opened the door. Sarah smiled politely, her cheeks pink from the cold, and assured me she knew exactly where the gloves were. I allowed her inside, and she went straight upstairs to Ethan's bedroom. As the minutes ticked by, an uneasy feeling settled over me. It had been too long. I texted Ethan, "Your coworker Sarah is here. Did you know she left gloves?" He replied almost immediately, "I don't know anyone named Sarah. Lock the doors now." My heart sank. Just as I was about to call out to her, she descended the stairs, gloves in hand. "Found them," she chirped. I tried to appear calm, but my voice shook as I asked, "How long have you known Ethan?" Her smile faltered, and she gave a vague answer before quickly leaving. As soon as the door closed, I bolted it and called Ethan. He confirmed he had no coworkers named Sarah and asked me to check if anything was missing. I searched the house, but everything seemed untouched. Still, the encounter left me rattled. Midnight came and went. I celebrated the new year with a glass of whiskey, trying to shake the unease. Milo was curled up beside me when the sound of footsteps outside the house caught my attention. Someone was pacing around the property. I turned off the lights and peered through the blinds, spotting a figure moving near the side gate. Panicking, I texted Ethan again, and he called back instantly, urging me to call the police. Before I could dial, the footsteps stopped, and a soft tapping came from the living room window. Milo hissed and darted under the couch. My stomach twisted as I slowly turned to face the window. There, pressed against the glass, was Sarah, smiling eerily. I froze, unsure of what to do, until she started banging on the glass, shouting Ethan's name. My hands trembled as I called 911. She continued her frantic pounding until red and blue lights flashed outside. As the police arrived, she bolted into the darkness. The officers searched the property but found no sign of her. They suggested she might be a stalker or someone with ill intent, but without further evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Ethan was horrified when I told him the full story and decided to change all the locks. To this day, I wonder what Sarah really wanted and if she was even her real name. The thought of her face pressed against the glass still sends chills down my spine. That New Year's Eve made me question whether I'd ever house it again. It was New Year's Eve, 2022, and my friend Carter was hosting a house party to celebrate. I arrived early to help set up, securing a coveted spot to sleep in the guest bedroom so I could drink without worrying about driving home. Carter's parents were out of town, leaving us full run of the place. A large, two-story house with a basement that always gave me the creeps. The party was loud and chaotic, as most New Year's Eve parties tend to be. By midnight, everyone was cheering and toasting the new year. Slowly, As the hours passed, the crowd began to thin out. By 3 a.m., it was just Carter, our friend Nate, and me sitting in the living room. We were buzzed but not wasted, chatting idly as the adrenaline of the night wore off. That's when we first heard it, a faint creaking sound. At first, we dismissed it as the house settling or the wind rattling a door. But the noise continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like the sound of someone slowly rocking back and forth. "What is that?" Nate asked, his voice breaking the silence. He was slumped on the couch, half asleep, but even he couldn't ignore it. Carter shrugged. "Probably the old fridge in the kitchen," he said. "It makes weird noises sometimes." But the sound wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was coming from the basement. Carter and I exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of us wanted to say it, but we both knew where the sound was coming from. "It's probably nothing," Carter said, more to himself than anyone else. "Maybe the heater?" "Let's check," I suggested, though the words felt like a dare I didn't want to take. "No way," Carter shot back. "You check." After a moment of arguing, we agreed to go down together. We grabbed a couple of kitchen knives, more for our own sense of security than practicality, and headed toward the basement door. The creaking stopped as soon as Carter opened it, revealing the pitch-black stairwell below. "Hello?" Carter called out, his voice echoing faintly. No response. We stood there for a moment, listening, before he flipped the light switch. The single bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered on, casting long, ominous shadows over the cluttered basement. "Let's just get this over with," I muttered. We descended slowly, the stairs creaking under our weight. The basement was cold, the kind of cold that felt unnatural, seeping into your bones. It wasn't very large, just a couch, a TV, an old bar, and various pieces of junk piled in the corners. We searched every crevice, opening storage bins and checking behind furniture, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. That's when I noticed the rocking chair. It sat in the far corner of the room, old and worn, its wooden surface scratched and faded. I hesitated, then walked over and gave it a push. The chair rocked back and forth, producing the exact same creaking sound we had been hearing. "It's just the chair," I said, laughing nervously. "See? Nothing to worry about." Carter didn't laugh. He was staring at the chair, his face pale. "That used to belong to my grandma," he said quietly. "She died years ago. My mom keeps it for sentimental reasons." Something about the way he said it made the hair on my arms stand up. I stepped away from the chair, suddenly feeling like I shouldn't be near it. "Let's go back upstairs," I said. Carter didn't argue. We locked the basement door behind us and tried to laugh it off, but the uneasiness lingered. Nate was already passed out on the couch, oblivious to what had just happened. Carter and I decided to call it a night and went to our respective rooms. I woke up sometime later to the sound of creaking again. My heart sank. I glanced at the clock. 4:17 a.m. The sound was louder this time, like the chair was rocking furiously. I debated waking Carter, but something told me to check it out myself. I crept out of the guest room and down the hall, my steps silent on the carpet. The creaking grew louder as I approached the basement door. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't just the rocking chair. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Summoning every ounce of courage, I opened the basement door just a crack. The light was on, but the stairs were empty. The creaking stopped. I felt a wave of cold air rush past me, making me shiver. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the basement, followed by the sound of something crashing to the floor. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. Carter came running down the hall, his face a mix of anger and fear. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I whispered. "Something's down there." We stood there, staring at the locked door, neither of us daring to open it. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavy, like we were being watched. Carter finally broke the silence. "We're sleeping upstairs. Together." We dragged Nate off the couch and locked ourselves in Carter's room, barricading the door with a dresser. None of us slept much that night. The next morning, we cautiously opened the basement door. The light was off, and the room was eerily still. When we finally worked up the nerve to go down, we found the rocking chair tipped over on its side. Carter swore he hadn't touched it, and I believed him. We never figured out what happened that night, but Carter had his mom get rid of the chair the next day. To this day, I can't hear the sound of a creaking chair without getting chills. Whatever was in that basement, it wasn't just a piece of furniture, and it's something I hope I never encounter again. It was New Year's Eve, 2023, and my husband Adam and I were looking forward to a quiet end to the year. We had just returned to our upscale apartment complex after celebrating with friends. It was late, past 2 a.m., and the streets were unusually quiet. Our corner penthouse suite, located on the 7th floor, was the perfect retreat from the world. The building had limited access, requiring a key card for the elevator and security cameras covering most angles. Despite these measures, the doorman wasn't on duty that night, a detail I would come to regret. As the elevator hummed its way to the top floor, I leaned against Adam, relieved to finally be home. My feet were aching from the heels I'd worn all night, and all I could think about was getting into bed. When the elevator doors slid open, we stepped into the empty hallway. That's when we saw her. She was at the far end of the hall, moving in a way that can only be described as unnatural. Her thin, pale frame seemed to float as much as shuffle. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess, obscuring most of her face, and she wore a tattered black dress that hung from her like a shadow. Her bare feet shuffled against the floor, leaving faint smears of grime behind her. Adam and I froze. My first thought was that she might be drunk and lost, but something about her presence was wrong, terribly wrong. We knew all our neighbors on this floor, and this woman was unfamiliar. She stopped at the first door she came to, peering intently through the peephole, her movements slow and deliberate. Should we ask if she needs help? I whispered to Adam, my voice wavering. Wait, he replied, his eyes locked on the figure. She might just be drunk and embarrassed. We watched in uneasy silence as she made her way door to door, pressing her face close to each peephole. Occasionally, she would pause to hum, but the sound was more like a guttural growl, a noise that sent shivers down my spine. I clutched Adam's arm as she neared the door of our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, or Tilly, as she liked to be called, was a sweet but lonely woman in her 70s. Her family rarely visited, and I often helped her with groceries or brought her leftovers. Seeing this strange woman linger at Tilly's door struck a nerve. "Excuse me," I called out, unable to contain myself. "Are you all right?" The woman froze mid-step, her hunched frame trembling as if startled. Then, without warning, she let out a low, raspy laugh that gradually grew into a disturbing cackle. She turned slightly, her head tilting just enough for me to glimpse one dark, hollow eye beneath her hair. Adam stepped forward. "Hey, do you need help?" he asked, his voice firm but cautious. The woman's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a wet, guttural sound like she was choking on something. She stood to her full height, which wasn't much taller than me, but her presence felt enormous. Slowly, she turned to face us fully, revealing a mouth stained black as if she had been chewing on charcoal. Her lips parted into a toothy grin that was anything but friendly. My heart raced as Adam grabbed my hand. "Let's go," he muttered, pulling me toward our suite. But before we could take more than a step, the woman lunged forward, slamming her hands against our door and screaming incoherently. The sound was primal, like an animal in pain, and it echoed down the hallway. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as Adam yelled at the woman. "Stop! What are you doing?" The woman ignored him, her hands pounding on our door until it rattled in its frame. Then, just as suddenly as she had started, she stopped. She collapsed onto the floor, her movements jerky and unnatural, and began crawling toward us on all fours. Her head tilted upward, and her mouth opened wide, emitting a guttural hiss. "Run!" Adam shouted. We bolted for the emergency staircase at the other end of the hall. My heels clattered loudly on the stairs as we descended, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We stopped on the 5th-floor landing, pressing our ears to the door to listen. The building was eerily silent. "Do you think she followed us?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Adam shook his head, but his eyes were wide with fear. After several agonizing minutes, we decided to cautiously return to our floor. The hallway was empty, and our door showed no signs of damage. We hurried inside, bolting the locks behind us. I could barely sleep that night, haunted by the woman's hollow stare and unnatural movements. The next morning, Adam spoke to the landlord, requesting footage from the security cameras. He returned looking pale and shaken. "The cameras glitched," he said. "Nothing was recorded after 1 a.m. The landlord dismissed our story, suggesting it might have been a prank or a hallucination, but I knew what we saw was real. We moved out of that building 6 months later, but every New Year's Eve, I find myself staring at the door, half expecting to hear that primal scream again. Whoever, or whatever, that woman was, she wasn't drunk and she wasn't lost. She was looking for something, and I can only pray she didn't find it." It was December 31st, New Year's Eve. My buddy Ethan had asked me to watch his dog, Riley, while he went out of town for the weekend. I'm 36 and he's 29. So while he was chasing the festive chaos of New Year's parties, I was fine staying in, earning some extra cash and relaxing with Riley, a small, quiet Labrador mix. Ethan left early in the morning, saying he'd be back by Sunday night. He left basic instructions: feed Riley, walk him twice a day, and keep him off the furniture. I brought along a backpack with my laptop, toiletries, and a change of clothes, ready for a quiet weekend at his place. Ethan and I weren't lifelong friends, but met a few years ago through mutual acquaintances and occasionally hung out. I would be crashing on the futon in his spare bedroom. The day was uneventful, a mix of movies and video games. By nightfall, I texted my girlfriend, Mia, to join me after her late shift. She'd arrive around midnight. At about 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, wearing a hoodie and holding a coat. She introduced herself as Ethan's girlfriend and claimed she'd forgotten something in his room. Suspicious but polite, I let her in. She quickly went upstairs, saying she knew where her item was, leaving the door slightly ajar. I texted Ethan immediately, "Didn't know you had a girlfriend?" He didn't reply, and she left shortly after, her jacket still in hand. I tried making small talk as she headed out, but her cryptic response, "Too long," accompanied by a strange laugh, left me unsettled. Ethan finally picked up my call, drunk and confused. "Who? I don't have a girlfriend," he shouted. As I described the woman, his tone grew serious. He urged me to check his room. I found nothing missing but could sense his mounting panic. "Stay alert," he warned. By midnight, Mia arrived. I explained the odd encounter, which left her just as uneasy. As we chatted, Riley suddenly lifted his head, staring at the front door. Moments later, a soft knock broke the silence. Neither of us dared to answer. I called Ethan again, but he was unreachable. Whoever it was left after a few minutes, but the tension in the house was palpable. We decided to sleep in the spare bedroom, locking the door behind us. Around 2 a.m., Riley began growling at the door, his hackles raised. Faint footsteps echoed outside, followed by the sound of the doorknob twisting. A woman's voice called out, "Ethan?" I shouted back, "The police are on their way." The footsteps retreated. Mia called 911, whispering the details. Minutes felt like hours until the police arrived, finding the front door ajar but no one inside. Ethan returned early the next day, shaken but thankful nothing was stolen. He later admitted to knowing the woman, a volatile ex. She had likely taken a spare key left in his room. The locks were changed immediately, but the eerie sense of vulnerability lingered. To this day, I can't shake the thought of what her intentions might have been if we hadn't been there. It was New Year's Eve, 2023. The world was slowly returning to normal after a chaotic couple of years, and my friend Tyler decided to throw a house party to celebrate. Tyler lived in a spacious, 2-story home on the outskirts of town, a perfect spot for gatherings like this. I arrived early to help him set up, staking my claim on a sleeping spot in his parents' room upstairs. His parents were out for the night, so the place was ours. By 10 p.m., the party was in full swing. The house was filled with the hum of laughter, clinking glasses, and music booming from the speakers. I didn't know everyone there. Tyler's friend group was larger than mine, and he had invited a mix of close friends and acquaintances. Despite this, the energy was lighthearted, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Midnight arrived, and we counted down the seconds. When the clock struck 12, the room erupted in cheers, hugs, and the clinking of drinks. After the initial rush of celebration, people slowly began to disperse. Some headed home, others to nearby bars or other parties. By 2 a.m., the house was significantly quieter. Only a handful of close friends remained, including me, Tyler, and Cody. As the hours crept past, the three of us sat in the living room, nursing the last of our drinks. Cody was half asleep on the couch, while Tyler and I chatted idly. It was then that we first heard it, a faint creaking noise coming from the basement. At first, we dismissed it. Houses make strange noises, especially older ones like Tyler's. But the sound persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone, or something, rocking back and forth. Tyler joked, "Maybe it's the ghost of my grandma. She used to love sitting in that rocking chair down there." We laughed it off, but the noise continued, gnawing at the edges of our conversation. Eventually, it became too distracting to ignore. Tyler and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Should we check it out?" I asked. Tyler hesitated. "I don't know, man. What if it's just the wind or the furnace? Do we really want to go down there and freak ourselves out for nothing?" But curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed flashlights, more for show than anything, as the basement had working lights, and made our way to the door leading downstairs. The creaking grew louder as we approached, sending chills down my spine. Tyler swung the door open and called out, "Hey, if someone's down there, you better leave now." His voice echoed into the darkness, but there was no response. The creaking stopped abruptly, as though whoever, or whatever, was making the noise knew we were listening. My heart raced as we descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was cold and smelled faintly of mildew. It was a cluttered space, filled with old furniture, boxes, and holiday decorations. In the corner stood the source of the noise, an old rocking chair, swaying gently back and forth. "Dude," I whispered, my voice shaky. "What the hell?" Tyler approached the chair cautiously, his flashlight trained on it. He reached out to stop its movement, and it fell still. "It's just a chair," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We searched the basement thoroughly, checking every corner and crevice. There was no sign of anyone. Still, the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive even. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we prepared to head back upstairs, something caught my eye, a handprint on one of the basement windows. It was faint but fresh, the kind of mark you'd leave if you pressed your palm against cold glass. "Tyler," I said, pointing it out, "did you see this?" He frowned, stepping closer to examine it. "That's weird," he admitted. "Maybe someone was outside?" The possibility sent a new wave of unease through me. We checked the window, but it was locked from the inside. Whoever, or whatever, had left that print couldn't have entered through it. The thought made my stomach churn. We hurried back upstairs, locking the basement door behind us. Cody was awake now, groggily asking what had happened. We told him about the chair and the handprint, and his expression grew serious. "That's messed up," he muttered. "You sure no one's down there?" We nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. We tried to settle back into our conversation, but the mood had shifted. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Around 4 a.m., as we were preparing to finally call it a night, the creaking returned, louder this time, more insistent. My skin prickled as the sound traveled up through the floorboards. Cody's eyes widened. "You locked the basement door, right?" "Yeah," Tyler said, though his voice was tinged with doubt. Summoning what little courage we had left, we decided to check again. This time, we armed ourselves with kitchen knives, a laughable attempt at self-defense. The basement door was still locked, but the creaking persisted, as if daring us to come closer. Tyler unlocked the door and flung it open. The sound stopped instantly. We stood there, paralyzed, staring into the darkness below. "I'm not going down there again," I said firmly. Neither was Tyler. Instead, we locked the door and piled furniture against it, barricading ourselves in the living room. None of us slept that night. Every creak and groan of the house sent us into a panic, but nothing else happened. The next day, Tyler's parents returned, and we told them everything. His mom went pale when we mentioned the rocking chair. "That chair belonged to my mother," she said quietly. "She used to sit in it every night before she passed." Tyler's dad dismissed our story as drunken paranoia, but his mom wasn't so sure. She insisted on moving the chair to the garage, saying it gave her the creeps. Tyler later admitted that the creaking noise had happened before, but never this intensely. I haven't been back to Tyler's house since that night. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Was it the wind? A trick of the mind? Or something more sinister? All I know is that when I think about that chair rocking on its own, my chest tightens with a sense of dread I can't shake. It was the early hours of December 31st, 2022, and my husband and I had just returned to our apartment after a small New Year's party at a friend's house. It had been a low-key gathering. Some drinks, a few laughs, but as much as we enjoyed the company, we were ready to call it a night. Both of us were exhausted, and the frigid winter air made us eager to get back inside. Our apartment complex wasn't the kind of place where odd things happened. It was a modern, secure building in a quiet part of town. We lived in a corner unit on the top floor, a place we had called home for nearly 3 years. The floor had limited access, and we knew all our neighbors. The complex had a doorman during the day, multiple security cameras, and 2 heavy front doors requiring key fobs to enter. That night, there was no doorman in sight, but that wasn't unusual this late. The lobby was eerily quiet, and the fluorescent light overhead flickered faintly as we passed through. The elevator ride was uneventful, though I felt a creeping sense of unease as we ascended. It was nothing I could pinpoint, just the weight of the silent night. When the elevator doors opened, we stepped out into the hallway. The long corridor was dimly lit, with soft beige carpeting and doors spaced evenly on both sides. Our apartment was at the far end, around a corner. We had barely taken a few steps when we noticed her. A woman, or at least something that resembled a woman, was meandering down the hallway. Her back was turned to us, and her movements were strange. She leaned heavily against the wall, her dark, disheveled hair hanging over her face. Her clothing, a black lace dress, looked tattered and worn, and as we watched, she stopped at each door, peering intently into the peepholes. I hesitated, looking at my husband, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Do you recognize her?" I whispered. He shook his head. "No. Do you think she needs help?" We debated whether to approach her, but something about her movements was unsettling. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, and her arms hung limply at her sides, yet she moved with a strange, deliberate intent. As she stopped at another door, we could hear a faint humming, if you could call it that. The sound was low and guttural, more like a growl than a tune. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Let's just wait," my husband murmured. "Maybe she's drunk and trying to find her way back to her apartment." But the longer we stood there, the more uneasy I felt. The woman moved closer to the door of Tilly, our elderly neighbor. Tilly was kind and soft-spoken, but frail and often alone. My protective instincts kicked in. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaky but firm. "Are you all right?" The woman froze mid-step. Her head jerked slightly, as if startled by the sound of my voice, and then she hunched down, crouching near the floor. For a moment, I thought she was going to collapse. My husband took a cautious step forward, but the woman suddenly let out a soft, rasping laugh that grew louder and more guttural. She straightened up slowly, her head still tilted unnaturally, and began to turn towards us. When her face came into view, I felt my stomach drop. Her eyes were impossibly dark, almost void-like, and her lips were stained a deep black. Her skin was pale, with an ashen quality that didn't look natural. She stood motionless for a moment before letting out another laugh, a sound so unnatural and eerie that it seemed to reverberate through the hallway. "Hey," my husband said, his voice firmer now. "Do you need help? You can't just—" Before he could finish, the woman bolted down the hall. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, as though her body didn't quite know how to work properly. She stopped abruptly in front of our apartment door and began pounding on it with both fists, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Open the door!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Let me in. Open the door." Frozen in shock, I fumbled for my phone. My husband yelled at her to stop, but she didn't acknowledge him. Her fists continued to hammer against the door, each impact echoing down the empty corridor. Her screams grew louder, almost animalistic, and I could hear a faint rattling sound, like something stuck in her throat. I dialed 911 with trembling hands, whispering to the operator as I explained what was happening. The woman suddenly stopped pounding and fell to the ground, crouching on all fours. For a moment, there was silence, save for her raspy breathing. Then, she began crawling toward us. Her movements were disturbingly fast, like a spider scuttling across the floor. She let out a low growl, her head snapping up to reveal those empty, black eyes. "Run!" my husband yelled, grabbing my arm. We sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. Instead of waiting for the elevator, we headed for the staircase at the opposite end of the building. We descended 2 flights before stopping to catch our breath, listening for any sign that she was following us. The silence was deafening, save for the pounding of my heart. After several minutes, we cautiously made our way back upstairs. The hallway was empty, and the woman was gone. Our door showed signs of damage from her pounding, but it was still locked. Inside, everything seemed untouched. The police arrived shortly after and searched the building but found no trace of her. The security cameras, they told us later, had malfunctioned due to the cold, so there was no footage of the incident. When we spoke to the landlord the next day, he assured us he would tighten security, but his reassurances did little to ease my lingering unease. To this day, I don't know who or what that woman was. Was she merely a disturbed individual, or was there something more sinister at play? We moved out of the building a year later, but every New Year's Eve, I can't help but relive that night, wondering if she ever returned to haunt the halls. It was December 30th, the eve of New Year's Eve. My friend Sam asked me to house sit and look after his dog, Molly, while he spent the weekend in the countryside to celebrate the new year. I'm 36, and Sam is 28, so my priorities are a little different from his. While he's partying, I'm more inclined to take a quiet night to earn a little cash. New Year's Eve fell on a Sunday that year, and Sam had left earlier that Saturday morning, promising to return late Monday. Molly was a petite German shepherd mix, barely half the size of a full shepherd and very quiet, a dream dog for sitting. Sam left basic instructions: feed her twice a day, take her for 2 walks, and keep her off the furniture. Simple enough. I brought a backpack containing my laptop, some toiletries, and a change of clothes. Sam and I had only been friends for a year or so, meeting through mutual acquaintances and occasionally hanging out on weekends. That night, I would be staying in the guest room on a pull-out couch. The day was uneventful. I killed time playing Sam's video games and working on my laptop. Later, I texted my girlfriend, Emily, asking if she wanted to join me for the evening. With Sam's blessing, she agreed to come over after work, which meant she wouldn't arrive until close to midnight. Around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before answering. At the door stood a woman, probably in her early 30s, wearing a tattered coat and holding an umbrella. She introduced herself as Sam's ex-girlfriend and said she had left something important in his room and needed to retrieve it. I offered to get it for her, but she insisted she knew exactly where it was. Though skeptical, I let her in, texting Sam to confirm her story. She went upstairs and stayed in his room for several minutes before coming back down with a small bag. I tried to strike up a conversation, asking her name and how long they'd been together, but she only replied cryptically, "Too long," with a forced laugh. Then she left. When I finally reached Sam, he sounded confused. "What are you talking about?" "I don't have an ex," he said. Alarm bells went off in my head. I described the woman to him, and he panicked. "Check my room right now," he demanded. I searched but found nothing missing, or at least nothing obvious. Sam, still trying to piece together who she might have been, sent me photos of women he knew. None matched her description. An hour later, he texted again. "I think I know who it was. Do not let her come back." I didn't press for details, assuming it was some personal drama. By midnight, Emily arrived, and we spent the rest of the evening in the living room. I told her what happened, and she was as unsettled as I was. Then, a knock at the door interrupted us. Bailey growled, standing at attention by the door. The knock was slow and deliberate, and whoever it was didn't ring the bell. I decided against answering. Emily whispered, "Who could it be?" I texted Sam again, but he didn't respond. The knocking stopped, and everything went quiet. We locked ourselves in the guest room for the night. Molly, usually calm, paced nervously by the door. At one point, her low growls turned into howling, waking us up after we had barely fallen asleep. Suddenly, footsteps echoed outside in the hallway. Then, the doorknob jiggled violently. A woman's voice called out, "Sam?" Emily clutched my arm, and I shouted, "The police are on their way." My bluff worked. We heard whispers and then retreating footsteps. Emily quietly called 911. The police arrived quickly but found no one in or around the house. The next morning, Sam returned, visibly shaken when I recounted everything. He admitted he had an unsettling history with someone who fit the description. "She wasn't here to take anything," he said grimly. "She's dangerous in other ways." Sam changed his locks the same day. Though he assured me he'd handle it, the incident stayed with me. To this day, I wonder what her true intentions were and whether she might return. It was New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2021, and the air buzzed with excitement as everyone eagerly awaited the end of a chaotic year. My friend Marcus was hosting a party at his family's lake house, a sprawling yet cozy property nestled in the woods. He'd assured us we'd have the place to ourselves, as his parents were out of town for the holiday. The house was a perfect setting for a party: spacious living areas, a basement with a bar and games, and enough bedrooms to crash in after a long night of celebrating. I arrived early to help set up, securing one of the upstairs guest rooms for myself. The house was already alive with decorations and the faint hum of music as Marcus prepped for the evening. By the time midnight approached, the house was packed. Friends and acquaintances mingled, music thumped, and laughter filled every corner. As the countdown began, everyone gathered in the living room, raising their glasses to toast the new year. When the clock struck 12, the house erupted in cheers, a cascade of fireworks booming in the distance. By 2 a.m., the party began to dwindle. People started to head home or migrate to other parties, leaving behind only a small group of close friends. The energy shifted into a more relaxed vibe as Marcus, his best friend Troy, and I settled into the living room to unwind. A couple of others were still lingering in the kitchen, but the once lively house was now quieting down. It was around 3 a.m. when we first heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking noise. At first, none of us paid it much attention. The house was old, and old houses make strange noises. Marcus shrugged it off, muttering something about the wind, but the sound persisted, growing more distinct. "What is that?" I asked, my ears straining to pinpoint the source. Troy, half asleep on the couch, mumbled, "Probably just the furnace or something." But it wasn't the furnace. The noise had a deliberate cadence to it, like the sound of wood straining under weight. It reminded me of something rocking back and forth. Marcus frowned. "It's coming from downstairs." We all exchanged uneasy glances. The basement. Marcus's parents had converted it into a rec room years ago, complete with a bar, pool table, and a small collection of antique furniture. Among the antiques was an old rocking chair, a family heirloom that had belonged to Marcus's late grandmother. He mentioned it once in passing, saying his mother kept it for sentimental reasons. "You think it's that chair?" I asked, half joking. Marcus gave me a nervous laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. Probably just something settling." Despite his dismissive tone, I could see the doubt flicker across his face. The noise continued, slow and steady, the sound crawling up from the depths of the house. After a few minutes of trying to ignore it, Marcus sighed and stood up. "All right, let's go check it out. You guys coming?" Troy groaned, reluctantly dragging himself off the couch. I hesitated but followed. None of us wanted to admit it, but the sound was getting to us. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and made our way to the basement door. Marcus flicked on the overhead light, illuminating the wooden staircase leading down. The creaking stopped the moment we opened the door, leaving behind an unsettling silence. "See? Nothing," Marcus said, though his voice betrayed his unease. Still, we descended the stairs cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The basement was dimly lit, cluttered with holiday storage boxes, old furniture, and random odds and ends. The rocking chair sat in the corner near the bar, its worn wooden frame catching the faint light. It wasn't moving. "Nothing here," Marcus said, a little too quickly. He walked over to the chair and gave it a push, causing it to rock back and forth. The sound it made was identical to the creaking we'd heard upstairs. "Maybe it's just the wind pushing against the house," Troy offered, though his eyes never left the chair. I wasn't convinced. Wind doesn't move rocking chairs in basements. Marcus let out a nervous chuckle. "Okay, mystery solved. Let's get back upstairs." We all turned to head back, but as we reached the stairs, the creaking sound started again. This time, it was unmistakable. It was coming from the rocking chair. We spun around, our flashlights cutting through the shadows. The chair swayed gently on its own, the rhythmic creak filling the air. "All right, screw this," Marcus said, his voice shaking. He bolted up the stairs, and Troy and I weren't far behind. We slammed the basement door shut and locked it, as if that would somehow keep whatever was down there contained. Back in the living room, we tried to laugh it off, but the tension was palpable. Marcus poured us shots, and we drank in silence, each lost in our thoughts. Eventually, the others who had been in the kitchen joined us, and we decided to put on a movie to distract ourselves. But the peace didn't last. Half an hour later, we heard the creaking again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from upstairs. Marcus froze, his face pale. "No one's up there, right?" We all stared at each other, the realization sinking in. The creaking sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just upstairs anymore. It was moving. The unmistakable sound of the rocking chair was now echoing through the house, as if it were dragging itself across the floorboards. "Okay, we're leaving," I said, grabbing my coat. Marcus tried to protest, but the sound of the chair scraping against the floor upstairs silenced him. We bolted out of the house, piling into our cars. I don't remember much about the drive home, only the lingering fear that the chair, or whatever was moving it, might somehow follow us. The next morning, Marcus called me. His voice was shaky as he told me his parents had come home and found the rocking chair in the living room, perfectly positioned in front of the fireplace. Neither of us could explain how it got there. To this day, I haven't been back to that house. Marcus's family eventually sold the property, and as far as I know, the chair stayed behind. Whatever was attached to it, I hope it's still there, far away from me. But every New Year's Eve, I can't help but think about that sound, the relentless creaking of the rocking chair, and wonder if it's still rocking, waiting for someone else to hear it. It was New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2022. My husband, James, and I had just returned to our high-rise apartment after a small celebration with friends. The bitter cold of the evening had us yearning for the warmth of home, and while we had indulged in a couple of drinks, we were far from intoxicated. For the most part, we were just ready to kick off our shoes and collapse into bed. We lived in a luxury apartment complex on Laurel Street. It was an upscale building with limited access to the upper floors, where we resided. Our corner suite on the 12th floor offered breathtaking views of the city skyline, especially on nights like this when fireworks painted the sky in vibrant hues. The building boasted tight security, with cameras in every hallway and a doorman stationed at the entrance. Though, as luck would have it, the desk was empty when we returned that night. As we stepped into the elevator, the familiar ding of the closing doors and hum of the machinery felt comforting. I leaned against James, my feet aching from the impractical heels I'd worn all evening. The elevator stopped smoothly on our floor, and we turned left down the corridor toward our suite at the very end. But as we walked, something caught my eye. A figure slouched against the wall midway down the hallway. At first glance, it looked like a woman, though her disheveled appearance was strikingly out of place in this polished building. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled clumps over her face, and her clothes, a frayed black dress that seemed decades old, were worn and tattered. She didn't appear to notice us, instead shuffling along the wall as though looking for something. "She probably got lost," James whispered, his tone wary. I nodded, but unease began to creep over me. We knew all our neighbors on this floor. An elderly couple, a young family, and a few others. This woman didn't belong here. As we moved closer, I noticed her actions were strange. She wasn't searching for a specific apartment or knocking on doors. Instead, she peered through each peephole, her movements slow and deliberate. Every now and then, a low, almost guttural hum escaped her lips, sending shivers up my spine. Should we ask if she needs help? I whispered. James hesitated, then shook his head. Let's wait a second. Maybe she's drunk or looking for the wrong floor. We stood frozen, watching her. She didn't acknowledge us but continued her strange routine, pressing her face against each peephole. The humming grew louder, and as it did, it began to sound less like a hum and more like a low, rumbling growl. My patience snapped when she stopped at the apartment belonging to our neighbor, Mrs. Tilly. Tilly was an elderly woman who lived alone. I had grown close to her over the years, often helping her with groceries or fixing small things in her home. My concern for her outweighed my fear, and I called out, "Excuse me, are you all right?" The woman froze. Her shoulders twitched violently, as though she was suppressing some kind of spasm. Slowly, she crouched down, curling into a hunched position on the floor. I took a cautious step forward, but James grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said under his breath. The woman let out a soft, menacing laugh, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for wind whistling through the hallway. The laugh grew louder, transforming into a raspy cackle that echoed ominously. "Hey, are you okay?" James called out, his voice firmer this time. The woman's laughter stopped abruptly. She stood up straight, her movements unnaturally rigid, and turned to face us. My heart skipped a beat as her face came into view. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown, and her skin was pale and gaunt. Her lips were dark, almost black, as if stained with something vile. She stared at us for what felt like an eternity before taking a step forward. "We should call someone," I whispered, fumbling for my phone. Before I could dial, she moved, stumbling toward our door with a sudden burst of energy. She began pounding on it with both fists, screaming incoherently. The sound was deafening, reverberating down the empty hallway. James stepped forward, yelling, "Stop that! What are you doing?" The woman stopped. For a brief moment, silence returned. Then, without warning, she dropped to her hands and knees and began crawling toward us at an alarming speed. Her growls returned, guttural and deep, almost animalistic. I froze, unable to process what was happening, but James grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the stairwell at the other end of the hall. We ran, our footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. We stopped 2 flights down, catching our breath. My heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out any other sound. James peeked back up the stairwell, but there was no sign of her. "Do you think she followed us?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," he replied. "Let's wait a minute." We stayed there, huddled together in the stairwell, for what felt like hours. Eventually, we mustered the courage to return to our floor. The hallway was eerily silent, and the woman was gone. Our door, thankfully, was unharmed. Once inside, I locked it, double-checked the windows, and collapsed onto the couch. My hands were still shaking. The next morning, James reported the incident to the landlord, who promised to review the security footage. But later that day, he called back with a bizarre explanation. The cameras had glitched due to the extreme cold, leaving no record of the woman's presence. To this day, I don't know who or what that woman was. Was she a lost, intoxicated soul, or something far more sinister? We moved out 6 months later, but every New Year's Eve, I can still hear her haunting growl in my mind, a chilling reminder of that night on Laurel Street. It was December 30th, a frigid Friday night, and my coworker Ethan had asked me to house sit for the weekend and care for his dog, Daisy, while he visited family. Ethan, 26, was a more outgoing type who loved celebrating holidays, while at 34, I was content to have a quiet New Year's Eve. I agreed, figuring it was an easy way to make some extra cash and spend the evening peacefully. Ethan's instructions were simple. Feed Daisy, a petite and unusually quiet Alaskan Klekai mix, walk her twice a day, and make sure she stayed off the furniture. I arrived at his cozy suburban home late in the afternoon, armed with my laptop, a few essentials, and a change of clothes. Though Ethan and I had only known each other through mutual friends, we got along well enough to trust me with his home. As the day turned into night, I kept myself occupied by playing video games and binging some old movies. Around 8:30 p.m., my girlfriend, Leah, texted me saying she'd come over after her late shift at work, but she wouldn't arrive until closer to midnight. At about 9 p.m., the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Puzzled, I approached the door, expecting maybe a neighbor or package delivery, but instead found a woman standing on the porch. She looked to be in her early 30s, wearing a gray hoodie with a jacket slung over her arm. She introduced herself as Ethan's ex-girlfriend, Kayla, and claimed she had left something in his room. Trying to be polite but cautious, I offered to retrieve it for her. She declined, saying she knew where it was. Reluctantly, I let her in, and she disappeared upstairs into Ethan's room. Feeling uneasy, I texted Ethan, "Hey, didn't know you had an ex dropping by. She's here grabbing something?" After what felt like an eternity, Kayla returned, thanked me curtly, and headed out. She brushed off my attempts at small talk, only leaving behind a cryptic remark about how things never change before vanishing into the night. I finally got a response from Ethan about 15 minutes later. His text read, "What are you talking about? I don't have an ex named Kayla, and no one should be in my house." My stomach dropped. I immediately called him and described the woman. Ethan sounded panicked, asking if I'd checked the room for anything missing. I hurried upstairs and looked around, but everything appeared undisturbed, at least as far as I could tell. Ethan, now audibly angry and alarmed, promised to make calls and figure out who she could have been. After an hour of back-and-forth texts, he finally messaged me, "If she shows up again, don't let her in. I'll handle this when I get back." Uneasy, but with no immediate danger, I went back downstairs and waited for Leah. Midnight came and went. We watched the ball drop on TV and tried to shrug off the earlier encounter. Just as we were starting to relax, Daisy stiffened and stared at the front door, letting out a low growl. Seconds later, there was a soft knock. Not the cheerful ringing of the doorbell, but a slow, deliberate tapping. I froze, unwilling to check. Leah whispered that I should ignore it, but the knocking continued, growing louder. I called Ethan repeatedly, but he wasn't answering. The knocking eventually stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Not taking any chances, Leah and I retreated to the guest bedroom, locking the door behind us. Daisy followed us inside but seemed agitated, pacing back and forth. We finally managed to drift off, only to be jolted awake an hour later by Daisy's frantic barking. Someone, or something, was just outside the bedroom door. A faint, feminine voice called out, "Ethan, are you in there?" Leah and I stared at each other in terror. I shouted, "I've called the cops, and they're already on their way," hoping to scare them off. The voice stopped, and after a brief shuffle of footsteps, everything went quiet. We didn't leave the room until the police arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the house and found the front door slightly ajar, but nothing appeared stolen or out of place. The officers noted it could have been an attempted burglary, but didn't rule out something more sinister. Ethan, still away, was mortified when I relayed the story. He promised to replace the locks and later confessed he had an inkling of who it might have been, a past acquaintance with troubling intentions. That weekend left me shaken, and I swore I'd never house sit again. To this day, I wonder what that woman really wanted, and if she had returned to the house after Ethan came back.